Welcome to the WAN Manager podcast. This is your host, Bryan from TeleGeography, and we are doing another episode that takes a deep dive into a telegeography coverage area. Specifically this time, our WAN cost benchmark service that allows sellers or buyers of multinational corporate networks to price out WANs element by element and site by site. So, to help us with that, I have invited my colleague, Mike Bisaha, who is the head of our data science department here at TeleGeography. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Greg. How's it going?
Doing all right. So, yeah, we'll see if you and I can have a conversation about benchmarking that's not too long and too detailed for the listeners, right?
That's the hope.
Yeah. Okay. So, before our interview, I want to take a look at the data. If you've listened to our previous episodes of this podcast, you've heard me talk about our WAN Manager survey a lot. And of course, if you are a WAN manager and you're listening to this and you've not taken the 2020 TeleGeography WAN Manager survey, you should do so right now. We'll have a link to it in the notes or blog about this episode. But we've collected data about network and configuration for multinational WANs around the world in both 2018 and 2019. So we know a little bit about what some sort of typical enterprises look like. From a provider standpoint, about 55% of our respondents use some mix of global and regional providers. We're talking MPLS and DIA mostly there. Only about a quarter in our past 2 years of data, we're going with a single global provider, which used to be pretty common, as I recall, for our benchmark customers. In terms of products, MPLS is still the center of the WAN. I've talked a lot about this elsewhere, and I even have a lengthy blog post about it, about the future of MPLS, if you want to check that out. But around 67% of sites on average are running MPLS still. And DIA is only at about a third of sites, though I think we're going to see that shifting increasingly as time goes on. And then just to pull out one particular industry segment, industrials and publishing and media had the least MPLS. So they were the most likely to have moved on to internet. They're only around 50% of their sites averaged across all those companies that have MPLS. So in terms of bandwidth, DIA and broadband both skew toward higher capacities than MPLS, which is kind of not surprising because MPLS is more expensive. 70% of MPLS connections are 50 megs or below. Only about 45 are 10 megabits or below. And that shifts a little bit higher when you go DIA and broadband, like I said. And then last thing that relates to our benchmarking practice, more than 60% of enterprises have MPLS backups, and those are split pretty evenly between active and passive. But it's important to note when you're thinking about this that usually means in either case redundant access lines. So since the access can make up a significant portion of the cost of a network, whether your backups are active or passive, if they have an additional access line that's always on, it really still makes a big difference in the cost of the network. So that was some background data, and now we'll get into talking to Mike Bisaha, head of data science at TeleGeography. All right. Hey, Mike. There's a bunch of data for you. You're probably going to talk a lot more about data.
Absolutely.
But before we do that, I thought it would be useful for you to just introduce yourself. Tell us about TeleGeography's benchmarking practice, what we benchmark, for whom, what purposes, and importantly, how does it work?
Absolutely. So, hi, everyone. My name is Mike Bisaha. I head up the data team here at TeleGeography. And Greg, you know me. I mean, it's in the title. I'm a data guy. So I always appreciate starting at the top with all those stats. It really helps set the table. Our group is really focused at TeleGeography on any project that is going to require tapping a large number of often quite large data sets and working on product deployment in terms of software development and providing new tools to interact with our wealth of pricing infrastructure data about the telecom industry. We do a lot of work with the pricing team, and our group helped build out the current WAN cost benchmark platform that we're going to be talking a little about today. But to your first question, Greg, what do we do with this? What is the benchmark? It
Hmm.
is a cost analysis for a wide variety of WAN designs and configurations. It's the focus is providing an unbiased third party view on pricing for corporate WANs, including underlay connectivity, rented equipment like CPE routers, and increasingly overlay services like SD WAN. The goal is really to
Everybody
bring, yeah,
wants to figure out how to change their network these days, right? Which I'm jumping ahead. We're going to get there, but yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
everyone does. But we have all these data sources available in a wide variety of databases that we have at TeleGeography. But this service is really built to provide a targeted view for a specific enterprise as to what they can expect to pay for a specific configuration of their network.
Right.
Uh,
So just explaining to the audience maybe a little more on that topic that we have a bunch of databases with hundreds of thousands of data points spanning decades in some cases.
mhm.
And the idea here was to distill those data points into something specific to a particular network rather than having people sift through like our telco clients might be more interested in doing, sifting through a huge global database. This tailors it to them, basically.
Yep, that's exactly right. I love working in database land, but not everyone does, and
Hmm.
we understand that. So this is meant to be something a little more user friendly for someone working on a specific project rather than needing ongoing access to the entire data set. This is for someone who really has a project they want to work on, and we can really tailor it to that user.
Hmm. All right, so Mike, who uses this? Who's the typical client, basically?
Yeah, it's there's a variety of clients segments that we work with. The most common is an enterprise WAN manager who's looking for some guidance on their current WAN design and cost structure.
Hmm.
We will occasionally do work with some of the carrier community as well. If they are perhaps going in for a renewal on a key account, they might come to us and look for a third party benchmark on how to approach that renewal. And we do also occasionally work with vendors who are looking at the cost implications of different network designs, whether that's an SD WAN vendor or some other kind of vendor. They will
So we're very
sometimes come to
neutral.
us. Yeah.
We'll inform all sides, let people make their own decisions, that kind of thing. Right?
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
But again, the most common is that enterprise WAN manager.
right. Okay, and so the enterprise is interested in sort of figuring out maybe what an alternative configuration should look like, or what they should be paying. What do they get? What do we give them?
Yeah, so they will get access to our online WAN cost benchmark portal. It is meant to be a tool that lets them see at a glance all of the sites on their network, all the network components that they have for their WAN infrastructure, and what
Hmm.
we expect based on our analyses those WAN components to cost. They can roll all those up by site, by total network. They can do a lot of what if analysis to swap out different technologies or experiment with different configurations. And then they can also, because we are geography in our name, do have geography in our name, we also allow you to map it and look at that on which sites you're paying the most, the least, and get some kind of geography analysis going.
Yeah, space and place, as I called it in geography grad school, right,
Space and
is
place.
really important in the telecom world, which a lot of people realize, but maybe don't realize the full extent of that idea. So, yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so now I can get to asking you some questions that I don't necessarily already exactly know the answer to, which is fun, right? Yeah.
It's good to learn
But
things, Greg.
yeah, absolutely. We understand now. I think more what you're doing, what your team does with MNC kind of networks. But I'm curious. I looked this up when I was preparing this interview. Our first benchmarking client was in quarter 4 of 2013. I remember working on that with you back when I
Mm-hmm.
still did these myself to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So thinking back, we don't have to go all the way back to 2013, but thinking back 5 years or so, what would you say the primary reason that enterprises were coming to us to get benchmarked then?
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting looking back. I did a bit of a retrospective too, preparing for the discussion
Hmm.
today, and it's been an interesting evolution we've seen since we first started this practice. When we first started doing these 5+ years ago, the focus for the clients was really on getting the most out of their renewal process. You would have customers who would usually be signing 3 to 5 year long-term contracts for their corporate WAN. It was often with a single supplier or maybe one or two suppliers. And it was primarily an MPLS network that they were working with. Because MPLS is expensive, because they were working with a single supplier, and in a lot of cases, making sure you get the most out of that renewal when it comes up every 3 to 5 years was really important. You could have a lot of important cost savings to be had that you could leave on the table if you didn't benchmark the network and know exactly what you should be going into this process with.
Yeah, and this is something we talk about a lot, which is that there's in the telecom world, right? Especially for people familiar with network services like wide area networks and transport and stuff, prices fall consistently, 15-20% per year, but they don't fall at the same rates for the same speeds, port sizes. They don't fall at the same rates in different geographies, and so just saying, oh, my WAN cost should go down, 15% year on year doesn't really do it, because it's way more complex than that. And so I think working with clients on thinking through that was probably a big deal back then, right? So
yeah. And to some extent, that still is. Space and place hasn't
yeah,
gone anywhere.
no, for sure.
But it was definitely the interest at the time on making sure you understood the cost implications over time, how much usually the MPLS, maybe a few DIA sites here or there, are falling in key geographies. Most importantly, your most expensive geographies, because that is just generally where the most money was to be had in a renegotiation.
Pity the people who have a site in Dubai and right. So,
yeah, I mean, everyone I'm
yeah.
sure has a story about their site in Dubai or in mainland China that they have a lot of
Yes,
issues with, and is a big cost sink. But cost of doing
absolutely.
business in a global marketplace.
Indeed.
Um,
No one thinks of the network when they're doing their office site location analysis, right? So, yeah.
Eventually, they do, but not
Yeah,
upfront.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, at the time, the other primary interest you would see from people doing kind of what if analysis in this world was really focused on the single provider versus multi provider strategy. That was really the
Mhm.
big question.
Right.
It was should I go with that one stop shop, maybe pay a little bit more to work with a global provider, or should I try to reap some of the price and diversification benefits from a multi provider strategy, maybe two or three providers regionally around the world?
Mhm.
But that was the primary interest in this. It was really about cost, and it was really about more market based redesign.
Right.
So who should I work with? How can I work maybe some of these providers with or against each other to get the best savings? We're in a very different world now.
Yeah. So what are the drivers now? What are people? What questions are our customers asking when they do their benchmark now?
Yeah, these days, customers who come to us almost always have a WAN redesign project in mind. They're either underway with it, or they have some things they've heard of
Mhm.
from their colleagues, perhaps at the WAN
At a
summits.
Win Summit. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. I got you there, Greg. Don't worry.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and they're interested in some of these new up and coming technologies that they see being more broadly utilized across the market.
Yeah, and I
Um,
mean, from the get go, the argument surrounding SD WAN hasn't just been will make your WAN work better, which ostensibly certainly it does, but it's always been focused around having this additional technology can lead to savings on the network side. So that's where we come in, right?
Exactly, exactly. And as you said at the top, helpfully, the MPLS is still the center of the WAN.
Hmm.
We still find that consistently in the WAN manager survey. But there are a much wider variety of technologies out there today, and there are as many, if not more, use cases for those technologies from each company. So again, SD WAN is definitely top of mind for a lot of our clients, as is integrating things like DIA and broadband into their network
Hmm.
where that makes sense for their business. But all this adds complexity to the network and to the WAN manager role in understanding and designing a network that gets the most bang for your buck out of this new WAN design or WAN topology.
Right. Not that it was easy 5 years ago, but to some extent, there was a simplicity to going to, the usual suspects, Orange, AT&T, Verizon, BT, whatever, and saying, I've got 250 sites and they need this much bandwidth, make it happen. Whereas now there's maybe for a lot of enterprises anyway, a more active role in thinking through exactly how to classify each office and all that sort of thing in terms of what they need, rather than just say, make it happen, right? So,
Yeah, and quite honestly, I think a lot of this is due to the fact that in the global economy, more and more value is being placed on digitizing your efforts, and technology in general is seen as an asset, and the WAN is now being seen as an asset of the company rather than a cost. When it was a
hmm
cost in the past, then it was something you tried to minimize as much as possible, but you kind of knew you had to do it, so
right.
you threw as little money as you could at it while still getting decent performance. Now people are asking, what can I do? What can I with my WAN? What can my WAN do for me, and how can it enable new apps and technology?
Right.
So it really changes how a WAN manager thinks about WAN topology. Um, that said, I always caution people, especially WAN managers, you don't want to jump in with the new shiny technology just to do it. Just because people are now
Right.
might be a little
Right.
more willing to throw some money at the new hot topic. You need to make sure you have a use case for it and know why you're doing it. Because throwing capital at your WAN without specific goals in mind is a recipe for disappointment on all fronts.
Especially doing that without having benchmarked it first, right?
No, yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, if we transition from an all MPLS kind of network, which was typical several years ago, like you said, to something that involves a bunch of new technologies, maybe SD-WAN, to orchestrate all of those technologies. What are some of the more novel configurations that you've seen lately? This is where I really am curious myself, because I'll talk to a lot of these customers at the WAN Summit or on the phone or whatever. But you and your team are the ones who dig in and really take a look at their network once they send it in and that sort of thing, and get to know what folks are actually running these days. What's some interesting changes that you've seen there in terms of how they have their networks set up or configured these days?
Yeah, no, there's definitely some interesting things going on. One of the more recent ones that we've been seeing in a handful of new benchmarks is some design concepts that really start separating out the core versus the edge, and sometimes
Mm.
multiple tiers
hmm
getting out to the edge. In previous iterations of the WAN, you might have seen one large MPLS cloud, but with your core sites having more a larger MPLS port than say your edge sites.
Right. Right.
Now we're seeing a lot more technology differentiation between core versus, say, that middle tier versus the edge sites. So your core might be a set of data centers or processing hubs that are meshed together with high performance point to point links.
hmm
Whether that's a full mesh or more often a partial mesh, with each hub having maybe one or two egress points to other hub locations, and that's all connected up with high performance wavelengths or what have you. And that is
Interesting. Right.
especially in the cloud world these days, where a lot of that the high power data processing happens. Um,
Right.
then that is on a entirely separate network, or that is only linked at a few specific nodes to, say, a DIA, MPLS, or broadband hybrid network that
hmm
is on more of the edge sites. One network we viewed had this even a step further, and had their very edge sites using SD-WAN or sometimes just IPsec over broadband to connect into a regional MPLS node. So you had this inner tier of MPLS
hmm
cloud that all of your edge sites connected to over IPsec, and then that MPLS cloud had a few specific nodes that connected into the core.
Right.
So we're really seeing this kinds of tiered solutions start to crop their way into WAN design, rather than one all-encompassing cloud.
hmm
Very specific technologies being used at different layers geographically of the network.
Right. So it's not plug my office into the intranet anymore. It's figure out what needs are at each of those different types of offices. I've talked to quite a few WAN managers that do sort of like a gold, silver, bronze kind of ranking of all of their offices in terms of whatever sort of breakout you want to do, but that different types of offices have different needs and
Hmm.
different places they're connecting into. Of course, these days
Definitely.
everybody's doing everything over IPsec anyway because everyone's at home. But yeah, so
Well, this is true. This is an interesting
yeah,
test case and how well that goes. But even to your
indeed,
point on gold, silver, bronze, in the past, that could have been different class of service tiers on a MPLS network or
right,
something like that. Now that is entirely different technologies being used at each of those tier sites. So
right, exactly.
while
My
a lot of
bronze
the
sites are
nomenclature,
broadband. Yeah,
yeah,
sorry, go
the,
ahead. Yeah.
no, the nomenclature is still often around when you talk to the WAN
Hmm.
managers from the old world, but what it means under the hood is changing quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
now the WAN is the underlay, right? So that
Hmm.
really took hold. The underlay and overlay nomenclature really took hold the last few years. We
That's
used to
true.
call it networks. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. The other thing that we've been finding quite interesting is the discussion around diversity. We
Mm-hmm.
used to, again, go back 5, 6 years. Someone would tell us whether or not their site had backup at it. Now, that was usually, do I have a backup port or a backup access line?
Right.
Now, when someone says, talks about their diversity strategy or talks about their backup strategy, they're often much more sophisticated discussions that we're having, where people are talking about supplier diversity, fiber route diversity, technology diversity. Am I using different MPLS versus DIA versus some kind of broadband from different providers?
Mm-hmm.
Even down to what kind of CPEs am I using? Do I have not only a backup CPE, but am I using multiple vendors? Um,
Right.
some of the we've seen one or two benchmarks that have taken this quite far in terms of what they mean by diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in our current view, I think we've seen individual sites that have up to 7, 8, 9 different network components across ports, access lines, CPEs with all of their associated backups. So what is actually associated with a site is becoming much more granular and much more diversified depending on the needs of that site. Um,
It's really interesting. It seems like there's a shift in some respects of the responsibility. Obviously, you can get a fully managed network, or maybe you have an outside managed services provider or whatever. So it's not to say that everyone's doing this themselves. A lot of our customers, I suspect, are because that's who needs the information from us directly themselves. But that the carriers used to be responsible for a lot of that, right? So it used to be
mhm,
the sourcing team at your enterprise service provider was the one who worried about whether your fiber was going through a different duct or whatever. Whereas now you're seeing enterprises themselves really thinking a lot more about how their physical and provider diversity it is at site by site rather than just saying that's my carrier's job, right? So
Yeah. Again, to use this contrast between 5 or 6 years ago and now frame, in the past, if there was a network outage, you might say, oh, well, a network outage in general might cost me X.
hmm
So I should make sure I spend some amount of money to prevent that kind of outage. Really, we're seeing more visibility down to the site level. How much per minute do I lose if this specific site is down?
right.
And it really drives your strategy at the individual site level. And there's often a huge difference between the each of those sites, and it's not always related to how much capacity there is. You might have a very small site that runs a very important function that if it goes
Right.
down, you lose a lot of money. So
Right.
it's not necessarily an easy mapping of high security and high reliability at my gig sites and not at my
Right.
5 megs. It really
Yeah,
goes down to the business case.
that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have like, whatever it is, say a factory that the business depends on that factory to be producing X amount of widgets per minute, and even if it's mostly an automated factory, it's running a lot of very low bandwidth IoT stuff or whatever the case may be. It's still crucial that you don't lose an hour of widget making or whatever, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So, in terms of running the WAN manager survey and doing the WAN summit, I end up talking to a lot of network managers, even if I don't dive into their networks in the same way that you do. And almost all of them are really considering some of these alternative configurations that we've been talking about: MPLS hybrid, maybe all internet, setting up their own backbones, like you mentioned, pushing more data and apps into the cloud. How does this affect the benchmark process, or even the sort of need to benchmark, like we've been saying, contrasting it with that like all MPLS network of several years ago?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it certainly complicates the benchmark process, primarily because you have a lot more to benchmark. You have a lot more individual components to track internally. And in general, when you increase the complexity of your WAN, you need to have increased visibility into it as well. Otherwise, you start losing track of what you have deployed at what sites, how much are they costing you, and
Hmm.
more importantly, why you decided to deploy that in the first place. Is it still doing what you meant it to do now that you've moved, say, an application to the cloud? Whenever you do something like that, there's going to be a knock-on effect on your WAN, and making sure you have not only a good inventory of what you have deployed, but what functions is it serving. Um, when you push it, say again, to go back to this cloud migration example, if you are pushing a very processing heavy app now into the cloud, you may have reduced some traffic volume to your edge sites. But on the other hand, you may have integrated a cloud technology that where you used to have some processing happening at the edge, it's now in the cloud, and you now need to have more traffic out to that edge to communicate with that edge piece of equipment or something like that.
Hmm.
So it really can go either way. It's hard to take just a heuristic and apply it across the board.
Hmm.
So making sure you not only are benchmarking to make sure you understand what you put in place, but continuing to actively monitor how that lines up with your traffic flows. It really makes keeping on top of this all the more important, in my view.
Well, and that's a good plug for having a TEM service. We don't do TEM ourselves at Telegeography, but we have a TEM partner, and I think that's one of the key arguments, right? Is that I think we have found that our benchmark customers sometimes have to go through considerable effort to even do a benchmark because they have to understand their inventory as it stands right now before they can even do the kind of analysis that you're talking about, and that's not always very straightforward, right? So today's episode is brought to you by our free ebook, All About Benchmarking. So, if you've enjoyed hearing about our data and reading about our hypothetical network benchmarking, then I think you might be interested in this particular resource. So, our collection of network data from sites around the world puts us in this unique position to share what we've learned using a hypothetical network that we put together just to review how minor and sometimes major changes to your network can move you closer to some specific goals like increasing your resiliency and reducing your overall spend. So if that sounds interesting, go to today's show notes, click the link, and you can download your free copy right there. But now I really want to get into the behind the curtain, as it were. So, Mike, you are managing this team of our folks who actually do the benchmarks, and I want you to kind of take us through the whole process. We get a customer from the sales team. Maybe someone like me has talked to them on the phone, and they've decided. Oh, no one talks on the phone anymore, do they? Well, whatever platform. Um, uh, and they've decided they want to go for it. They have 250 sites around the globe. They're running a variety of services. Take us through what happens. They've signed the purchase order. What comes next?
Yeah, so as soon as we get that go ahead, we will immediately reach out, if we haven't already, and ask them for a site list by address for all of their locations that they are either on their entire network or the ones that they're benchmarking.
Mm-hmm.
And we're asking them for an inventory of products, capacities, and technologies that they deploy at that site. Um, are you running MPLS or broadband or some hybrid at that site? Do you or will you be adding an SD-WAN overlay to it?
Mm-hmm.
What CPE routers do you have in place? What is your backup strategy? And then which of those sites are your core data center or processing hubs, and which are your edge locations? It sounds like a lot of information, and truthfully, it is because we try to make this as granular and specific a view to this tailored network view
Right.
as we
The more
can.
we know, the better the output is, right? So.
Exactly, exactly. So we do get pretty detailed, but we have our request dialed down to a decently manageable template that we will send over to them and ask them to fill out with their site information. Now, sometimes that's very easy for them to do. If they already have a lot of this well tracked internally, then it's maybe one or two clicks on an export function.
Hmm.
If not, then sometimes it can be a pretty a little bit of a drawn out process to go through and talk to multiple sub teams to figure out who has bought what over a certain period.
Yeah, I've
Um,
definitely talked to quite a few folks who, whether it's because of M&A or the way that the IT team was just organized from an HR standpoint and whatnot, that don't all the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing, right? So.
yeah, it's true. It's true. But the first step is really getting that initial input from them.
Hmm.
And then when they come back to us with that list, almost universally, we will continue to follow up with them with a few rounds of follow up questions, have one or two calls to walk through
Right.
exactly what they put in, exactly what they mean about these detailed configurations. We all like to
And
think we speak the
yeah,
same network language, but everyone has their own
I mean,
their own specific flavor.
just between different carriers, the telecom lingo can change carrier to carrier, let alone customer to customer. It can be frustrating sometimes, right? So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So we get deep into the weeds on that discussion and try to make sure we
Hmm.
have as clean a view as to what they have deployed today as
Right.
we can. In some cases, where they may not know some of the answers to those questions, we will put in some basic assumptions that we have from our history of doing these kinds of benchmarks. So we do
Hmm.
have that capability, but
Right.
again, we try to tailor it as much as we can.
It's
It is also often at this time that we hear from a client, we hadn't thought about that. Well, let's see both
right.
options.
Yes. Yeah.
Clients who originally thought, I just want to look at my network as it is today, pretty early on start seeing, oh, I actually do want to do scenario analysis.
Right.
So
Right.
we really have that built in from the tool, and they start seeing why we include that pretty early on.
Yeah, exactly. So you say this is network as it currently stands. These are the ways that we might envision it being in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. So really, just by asking questions of them in that
Hmm.
initial back and forth, it really helps clarify exactly what they have in place or what they're trying to do, what their goals
Right.
are with this whole process.
All right, so back to the geography part, right? So,
Hmm.
being at telegeography, and I'm honestly curious at how you're managing this kind of stuff these days, specifically. But one of the ideas behind the benchmark was that we have this global database. It's huge, but any given multinational only has sites at specific places. We get this site list from them. Sometimes that's specific addresses, right? At least. Postcodes or that kind of information. What
Hmm.
do you do? How do you then take that network and make it match with what data telegeography have from our surveys?
Yeah. No, so the first step is we geocode all that information. So we have some tools we use to make sure we have specific lat longs for everywhere, and then we start doing a lot of map work. We start trying to see what data we have in our data sets, how where the closest port hubs would be to all of their locations, match those up accordingly. And then from the access side, what distances they are away from those their sites are
Hmm.
from those hub locations, so we can start getting in the correct distance bands to match up with our access lines.
Right.
Those are the two real geographic components that we need: a port city. Again, this is for port-based analyses at that site. A port city, and then a local loop, an access line to extend from the POP location out to the customer address. So
And you
there's
have
a
most
lot
of
of
that automated, right? I mean,
a,
long ago, folks, I Mike and I would personally do a lot of this geographic research on our own, but most of that's all done on the back end now, right? So.
yeah. At this point, we have some more sophisticated machine learning algorithms we will use to match up the best geographies that we have, not only from a strict geography perspective, but also building in the data that is available in those geographies. As you
Hmm.
said at the top, not every carrier we work with to collect and source this kind of anonymized information works everywhere. There are invariably going to be specific geographies that are difficult to benchmark, whether that's Afghanistan, or some parts of rural China where you only have one or two by
Right.
law in a closed market.
Exactly.
Information on that kind of scenario is harder to come by.
I always
Um,
say landlocked Africa, the stands in China, everywhere else we can get you something, right? So yeah.
yeah, those. I
Yeah.
mean, those are. It's a good rule of thumb. Those are areas we're going to have to put some more time in. So
Hmm.
again, our first step is to geocode it and run it through our algorithms to get the best out of the box matches that we can to all of our data sets. After that, we don't want to just rely on we've passed it to this algorithm and we spit it out. Here you go. We really then, for those edge cases, bring in our analyst team and rely on their local knowledge of each of these markets that they cover much more extensively than our machine learning algorithm does, and use their expertise to tune the initial match specifically for those geographies where it needs the most attention.
So we
Um,
haven't been made redundant by the AI quite yet, right? So
Not quite yet. We don't need
yeah,
a couple more years, but
right.
let's have another podcast in 5 years and we can talk
That's
about that.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but no, there's still definitely a lot of value in that because especially in some of these edge markets, you may not get someone who works in a company even from a closed market who is willing to fill out a survey revealing their prices. So we need to rely on a variety of sources, conversations, kind of person to person research and analysis. So our analyst team is still a very important part of any benchmark that we do.
Hmm. Hmm. All right, so we've gotten their data, we've matched it to our data. The first thing they're going to get back, of course, is this is your network as it currently stands. Then what do we do for the sort of what if or scenario analysis? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so there's a couple different options you can go with. Some clients, when they come to us, will want to look at a series of what if analyses at different configurations they are considering out of the box, and they know that when they come to us. In those scenarios, we will often tell them, "Sure, give us those scenarios that you want. We will build them and load them into the tool for you. You can look at them side by side. You can look at cost comparisons by sites and by network." It's a nice thing to be able to provide our clients with some of that out of the box when we deliver all of this in their online tool. They can log
Right.
in and they see it all right there for them. So that's one option. The other option is carriers might just want to look at their initial configuration and then experiment with it themselves from there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we do allow them in the portal to create a cloned copy of their original network that they gave to us and make any changes they like. They can add sites, they can remove sites, they can change the capacity configurations or products that they're using. They can dial bandwidth up and down depending on the needs they have for that location. So it really lets them go in with a fine tooth comb and change a lot of the underlying assumptions that we put into our network, our initial benchmark, and look at a couple different scenarios that they themselves can build as they please. So there's really both options. There's the request it from us, we'll take care of it and push it into your tool for you. Or if they really want to get into it themselves, they can create their own copies and their own versions.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, a lot of you might have read my blog series from about a year ago. Started it a year ago, so that looks at like a hypothetical network, and I made a bunch of changes. I used our tool, doing it exactly the same way that an enterprise customer would. So that was it worked. So yeah, yeah.
Always good to hear.
Yeah. All right. So from that view of sort of the magic behind the curtain, what's the biggest challenge from a process standpoint for you and the data team working on this?
Yeah, I think there are two of them which we've already kind of alluded to, but the first is making sure we have that specific configuration information from the end user up front.
Hmm.
We occasionally will go through that process at the beginning, but we realize once we've delivered the benchmark that one of the inputs, maybe one of the regional groups they worked with, had an out of date file, or they were actively rolling something out, and we benchmarked the future state, but not the current state
Hmm.
of that component of the network. So really going back and forth and making sure we understand that up front. We try to do as best we can, but sometimes you don't find out about that till a little farther down the line. That can be a challenge. But that's one that in this kind of the data discovery process that we go through is part of the value of the service in
Mhm.
itself. It forces
Mhm.
everyone to get on the same page. So we make sure we take that very seriously. The other, I mean, we've already mentioned, it's those edge case geographies. We spend a
Right.
lot of the largest amount of our time going through those edge cases with our analysts. We're using any information we can find. We will occasionally go out and try to do some geography specific spot analyses and outreach to try to fill a need for a specific quote that a customer might have.
Mhm.
And we'll try to roll that in. But yeah, getting all of that ground level knowledge incorporated into the benchmark takes a lot of time. But again, a lot of the value is in that 20%. 80% we might be able to do quite easily based on just pulling straight from the database, and we feel
Right.
confident with all those figures. But making sure we spend the time to vet and really dial in that other 20% of the edge cases is really key because they're often the most expensive and they're often where there can be the most leverage for the client if they know what they should be paying in those markets.
So what you're saying there is you want the sales team to specifically go after accounting firms and law firms that have all their offices in major metros in multi-tenant office buildings, right? So that's
From my day-to-day time, yes, absolutely. But no, there's obviously a lot of global businesses out there. So and usually we don't get too many people who come to us with a network that is completely adversarial in terms of its geography makeup.
yeah, yeah.
So that's usually nice.
Well, and that's the strength of the sort of access data that we have in broadband is that I mean it really does go pretty much everywhere that there are enterprise kind of customers. So
Yep,
it may be
exactly,
more difficult, but we can do something, right? So
for sure.
all right, so moving on to the future, we've had this tool in place for I don't know several years now, and have been taking advice from customers and that sort of thing. So we're working now on our WAN cost benchmark 2.0. What changes are you making? What are you hoping to bring customers in this next iteration of the tool?
Yeah. So it's an interesting reflection of how things have changed from when we first built the tool. When we
Mhm.
first did this, again, as we said at the top, a lot of primarily MPLS or DIA port-based networks. We are now seeing a lot more SD-WAN, a lot more point-to-point links being integrated into some kind of core mesh.
Mhm.
Um, at the moment, we still have all that information, but that we can deliver to our clients, but we do it as an addendum
Right.
outside of the core platform. So we're
Right.
integrating SD-WAN and point-to-point links specifically natively into the platform, so you can see that side by side with your port-based sites. So
Mhm.
that we're excited about, and definitely meshes more with how WAN managers are looking at their network today.
Right.
Um, we are also adding some more flexibility into adding multiple cost components to a single site within the tool. So at the moment, there are only a handful of components you can put. They're the most common components. But if you want to add, say, multiple CPEs, multiple different ports with different technologies, at the
Mhm.
moment that shows up as a lot of extra rows in your table
Right.
rather than assigning those all to an individual site that you can drill into and really kind of configure to your heart's content.
So, like, somebody
Um,
comes to us, they have 250 sites around the world, 250 addresses, but their benchmark might be 500 if they're running dual services at all of those and that sort of thing.
exactly, and that can get a little confusing from a inventory management perspective to compare your own sites with how we've broken out the network. So we're trying
Yeah.
to simplify that down to really bucket site price components into a single site rather than broken out as much as they currently are.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I've talked to a fair bit of WAN managers who say, having adopted SD WAN, they actually want, I mean, literally three or four different underlay transport
mhm.
options at every site. So you might have, your DIA, your broadband, and LTE, and some satellite link or something at crucial sites. So it'd be nice to have all of that together. Although we don't cover satellite and likely never will, but just to throw that in there. Yeah.
It's a good caveat to throw in there. The last thing we're kind of looking at is increasing some of the bulk operations we allow to make this kind of what if analysis a little easier.
Mhm.
At the moment, it involves going into each site and configuring each one. Now, if you have a very large network, that can be time consuming. The reason we do it is we want to make sure you are actively selecting all the specific changes you want, and making sure that is well revealed within the network cost model.
Mhm.
We're doing some modeling work on the back end to allow people to more seamlessly make bulk changes, rather than having to do individual tweaking. So we're excited about that. It's a bit of a modeling project on our end to allow you to kind of do those cost curves a little more simply.
Mhm.
But it's a fun exercise for us, and we're looking forward to rolling it into the next version of the tool.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it and playing with it and maybe writing some new blog post analysis. So, yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
definitely.
All right, Mike. I think that's been a lot of information. Taking a much deeper look at what a benchmark is and why we do it and what it means. But I have to end with my unrelated COVID kind of question of the week. Usually about quarantine. But this time I thought I would mix it up a little because you became a dad for the first time. What was it like? Maybe 6 months ago, somewhere around there.
Yeah, just turned 7 months, so it's been
Months, right? Yeah.
yeah,
So
it's
what?
been very exciting.
Yeah.
Beyond the stereotypical lack of sleep,
Right.
things have been going very well.
7 months,
Um,
you're setting into a rhythm, right? So
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
our the most recent excitement is uh, our son Jack learning how that he can move himself around the room a little bit, not by crawling, but by just rolling across the room to get where he wants to go. So that's been a
This,
fun thing to watch.
I mean, you know, it's a little view into human development, right? So, all
Exactly.
right. So
Exactly.
what's been the most fun part, or did
What
you
has
just?
been the most fun?
Yeah. What's been the biggest challenge then?
Well, no, the challenge is, I mean, in the COVID world, the lack of childcare is certainly something that's tough. So my wife and I are definitely tag teaming it quite a bit to try to cover all our bases. But the day to day itself is also very fun. We get to spend a lot of time with the guy, and it's a blessing in disguise. We get to really get a good relationship with him built from day one. So it's been really fantastic at the end of the day.
When there's more of them and they're fighting while you're trying to think through a complicated market sizing equation, you will disagree. I can just tell you that right now from
I'm
your
sure my story will change by kid number two.
But yes, yeah, quarantine has been interesting, certainly. So excellent. All right. Well, congrats on that. And thanks
Thank you,
for
thank you.
being able to find a time where there was no screaming children in the background that you could talk to us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Cheers. Thanks. Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.